You're listening to a production of the National Media Archive. To learn more or volunteer, go to nationalmediaarchive.com. You do not have to be a trained psychologist to sit back and wonder why people sometimes do truly terrible things. It is normal to think about what drives someone to hurt others or to carry out acts that most people see as evil. Some say it might come down to their genes, something they were simply born with. Others argue that it has more to do with the environment they grew up in or the situation they found themselves in later on. This question sits at the very center of one of the most famous experiments in psychology, which focused on what happened during the time of the Second World War and the genocide that wiped out a huge number of Jewish people across Europe. Most people today agree without hesitation that what happened in that period was horrific beyond measure. But when you dig deeper, you get to a more uncomfortable layer. What about the people who carried out those orders? Why did they do it? Were they monsters from the start, naturally drawn to cruelty? Or did something else push them to follow such brutal commands? After the war, the German soldiers who had taken part in these atrocities were captured and put on trial. One of these men was named Adolf Eichmann, who played a big role in organizing how Jewish people were rounded up and sent to die. When asked why he did what he did, his defense was simple and unsettling. He claimed he was just doing what he was told. In other words, he did terrible things but claimed he was not really responsible for them. He pinned it all on the idea of obedience. He said he was only following orders. This single idea, obedience, caught the attention of a young psychologist at Yale University named Stanley Milgram. He wanted to know if people like Eichmann did horrible things because they were truly evil or because they felt they had to obey someone in charge. Milgram himself was Jewish, so this question was not just academic for him, it was deeply personal. So he designed an experiment that tried to answer one big question. Could ordinary people be pushed to do something they knew was wrong if someone in authority told them to do it? This became known as the Milgram shock experiment. To understand how this worked, imagine three roles in the study. First, there is the experimenter. This person is the one running the show, dressed in a white lab coat to look official and trustworthy. Second, there is the teacher. This is the person who actually takes part in the study and does not know the true purpose behind it. Third, there is the learner. The learner appears to be another participant, but in reality, they are secretly part of the research team, acting out a role to make the whole setup look real. The study was presented as a simple test about how people learn and remember information. The teacher's job was to read out word pairs and test the learner's memory. If the learner gave the right answer, nothing happened. But if they got it wrong, the teacher was told to deliver an electric shock. With each wrong answer, the shock was supposed to get stronger and stronger. But here is the catch. There were no real shocks at all. The machine they used looked real, complete with switches, labels, and even warning signs. It started with a tiny amount of pretend electricity and went all the way up to a terrifying 450 volts. Each level had labels, some marked with words like slight shock, others moving into dangerous territory, and finally, the highest marked with 3 crosses to show it could be deadly. The people who signed up to be teachers were men from the local area, recruited with flyers promising a bit of cash. When they arrived, they thought they were randomly assigned to be either the teacher or the learner by drawing slips of paper. But in reality, every slip made them the teacher. The learner was always the same actor, who knew exactly what to do. Once the experiment began, the teacher sat in front of the shock machine while the learner was strapped to a chair in another room. Whenever the learner made a mistake, the teacher flipped a switch, believing they were sending an actual shock through the wall. The learner responded by pretending to be in pain, yelling out, banging on the wall, and eventually falling completely silent if the shocks went high enough. All of this was fake, but the teacher did not know that. At some point, many teachers would pause and look at the person running the study. They did not want to keep going because they thought they were hurting someone. But the experimenter calmly told them to carry on, reminding them that it was important for the experiment and that they would take full responsibility. This placed the teacher in a clash between what they felt inside, their sense of right and wrong, and the pressure to obey a figure of authority. The results shocked everyone. Around two-thirds of the teachers kept going all the way up to the highest level of 450 volts, even though they believed they were causing real pain or even death. All of them went at least up to 300 volts before some refused to go any further. Many of these people were deeply upset while doing this, sweating, trembling, and showing signs of real distress. But they obeyed anyway. This experiment showed how powerful the situation can be. People who see themselves as good and moral can be convinced to do things they would normally find unthinkable when they feel they have no choice but to obey. This idea that ordinary people could become agents of harm just because someone in charge told them to is what made the Milgram shock experiment so famous and so disturbing. It challenged what many people like to believe about themselves. People tend to think they would stand up, speak out, and refuse to take part in something cruel. But what Milgram's study suggested is that when the pressure is on and an authority figure insists, even the kindest person can be pushed to ignore their own conscience. It is worth pausing to think about what the shock machine looked like because the design played a big part in making the setup feel real. There were rows of switches, each labeled with a number showing how strong the shock was supposed to be. Beside the numbers were words that hinted at how bad each shock could be, from slight shock to moderate shock, then strong shock, and finally danger and severe shock. By labeling the switches this way, Milgram made it feel like each step up was just a small increase, but taken together, they led people far beyond what they ever imagined they would do. Another thing that helped the experiment feel so believable was the white lab coat worn by the experimenter. This simple piece of clothing carried a lot of weight. It signaled authority, knowledge, and trust. When someone in a white lab coat told the teacher to keep going, it was harder to say no. The teacher was stuck in a tug-of-war between what they felt was right and what the person in charge told them was necessary. What is truly unsettling is how many teachers went on, even when the learner cried out in pretend pain. They heard shouts through the wall. Some teachers would ask if the learner was okay or if they should stop, but the experimenter calmly replied with phrases like, "Please continue," or "The experiment requires that you continue." This short, simple language kept the teacher trapped. Many felt torn apart inside, but they kept pressing the switches. After the experiment, Milgram wanted to know how the teachers felt. Many of them said they were deeply disturbed by what they did. Some broke down in tears during the experiment or afterwards. It showed that people did not enjoy causing pain. They felt forced by the situation. This brings up big questions about human nature. Are people naturally cruel, or does cruelty come out only when someone else pushes them toward it? The experiment did not give a final answer, but it made people think. It also connected back to the trials after the Second World War, where so many soldiers and officers gave the same excuse: they were just following orders. The Milgram experiment did not come without heavy criticism. One of the biggest concerns was whether it was ethical. Even if no one was really shocked, the teachers believed they were hurting someone. That caused real stress and guilt. Today, psychology has strict rules that say researchers must do no harm and must protect the well-being of participants. Back then, those rules were still forming, and Milgram's experiment played a part in shaping them. There was also debate about whether the teachers were pressured too much. Some critics argued that the experimenters' calm but firm instructions crossed a line. They said the teachers did not have true freedom to stop because they were gently pushed to continue, even when they wanted to quit. Another issue is whether everyone was properly debriefed afterwards. Some reports say that not every participant got a full explanation right away, which would have helped ease the stress and guilt they felt. Debriefing is now a basic part of any study involving deception. Participants must be told exactly what was real and what was not, and must be given support if they feel upset. There is also the question of whether the results would be the same today or with different groups of people. Milgram's original study used only men. Later versions tried including women and sometimes found small differences. Other researchers repeated the study in different countries and found varying levels of obedience. Sometimes the numbers were lower, showing that culture, context, and time period can affect how people respond to authority. One detail that stands out is the power of proximity. When the learner was in another room, hidden behind a wall, teachers were more willing to press the shock button. But when the learner was in the same room, or when the teacher had to physically hold the learner's hand on a metal plate, obedience dropped. It was much harder to cause harm to someone when looking them in the eye or feeling their presence up close. The lab coat and the wall are small things, but they shaped the outcome. They show that even tiny shifts in how we set up a situation can have a huge effect on what people do. This is why the Milgram shock experiment is still talked about. It is not just a lesson in psychology, but a mirror for society. It asks us to look at how systems, uniforms, titles, and walls can shape people's actions, sometimes for good, sometimes for terrible ends. Thinking about the Milgram shock experiment today, it remains one of those studies that people remember because it does not just sit quietly in a textbook. It sticks with you. It forces you to picture yourself in that small room with the switches, hearing someone cry out behind a wall, looking at a person in a white lab coat telling you to keep going. It is uncomfortable because it asks you to imagine what you would do. Would you stop and walk out? Or would you keep pressing the buttons, each one stronger than the last? Some people like to believe they would stand up, refuse, and walk away long before reaching the highest level. But Milgram's results suggest that the truth is not so simple. When faced with pressure from authority, even people who see themselves as kind and moral can find themselves pulled along by the flow of the situation. This brings up another reason why the experiment has been repeated and studied again and again. Researchers wanted to see what changes might make people obey less or resist more. For example, what if there were two experimenters in the room and they started arguing with each other about whether to continue? Studies found that when authority figures disagree, people feel more able to make their own choice and are more likely to stop. Another variation tested what happened if other teachers in the room refused to go on. If someone saw a peer stand up and say no, they were far more likely to stop too. This shows that disobedience can spread just like obedience does. Seeing someone break away can give others permission to do the same. There are lessons in this for how real groups and societies work. It is not just about shocking someone in a lab. It is about what happens when people in everyday life face orders that feel wrong. It could be a boss telling someone to fudge numbers on a report, or an officer telling a soldier to hurt civilians. The experiment makes us ask, who speaks up first? Who risks being the one to say no? Another thing the Milgram study makes clear is how responsibility gets passed around. Many teachers in the experiment said they felt better about continuing because the experimenter promised to take full responsibility. It did not matter that the teacher was the one pushing the switch. They were able to tell themselves it was not really their fault. This same thing happens in bigger systems. In any large organization, an army, a company, a government, there are layers of authority. People at the bottom often feel that they do not truly own what they do because someone above them signed off on it. This can blur moral lines and make people feel that following orders is the safest thing to do. But the flip side is that people can refuse. The experiment showed that while most did obey, some did not. Some teachers got up and walked out. They refused to keep going, no matter how firmly they were told to continue. Even though they were the minority, they proved that people are not robots. They have the power to choose, even under pressure. This is why the Milgram shock experiment is often taught alongside the idea of ethics. The study itself caused real emotional strain for the participants. Many felt sick with guilt when they found out what they had done, even if it was not real. That is why modern research must follow clear rules to protect people from harm. Deception is still sometimes used in psychology, but it must be justified, kept to a minimum, and followed by a full explanation and support. So today, when people talk about the Milgram shock experiment, they talk about two big lessons. One is about human nature, how easy it is to push people to obey authority, sometimes at the cost of their own morals. The other is about protecting people who volunteer for studies. It showed why we need strong rules about honesty, consent, and care for participants' well-being. Thinking about this, it helps to ask what you would do in that room. If someone told you to hurt another person, would you stand up or would you obey? Would you lean on the lab coat and the orders from above to feel safe from blame? Or would you trust your own voice inside telling you that something is wrong? In the end, the Milgram shock experiment is less about electric shocks and more about people, power, and choice. It shows that even the smallest detail, a wall, a uniform, a voice of authority, can shape what someone does when faced with a hard decision. And it leaves us with a question that does not really have an easy answer. When the time comes, will you obey or will you resist?